The needle was already in the technician's hand when the heavy steel door creaked open. Legend, a 65-pound pit bull labeled too dangerous to save, was seconds away from becoming another statistic in a crowded Dallas shelter. 3 families had already rejected him, swearing he was a monster. But as he turned his massive, blocky head toward the silver-haired woman standing in the doorway, his eyes didn't show rage. They showed a secret that every young, able-bodied trainer had missed. A plea for mercy that only someone who knew the weight of aging could understand. This story chronicles the desperate race against the clock to save a dog the world had discarded as broken. It explores the behavioral gap, where human fear often misinterprets physical agony for animal aggression. This is the moment a woman in the winter of her life gave a voice to a creature in the depths of despair, proving that what looks like hate is often just a silent scream for help. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and leave a like. Your support truly means the world to us. Thank you. Let's begin. The air in the front office was thick with the metallic scent of industrial bleach and the heavy, humid weight of a Dallas afternoon. Behind a cluttered desk sat Mr. Sterling, a man whose face was etched with the weary lines of a decade spent managing a facility that was always over capacity and underfunded. He didn't look up from the folder in front of him, a folder thick with reports and dominated by a red stamp that seemed to vibrate against the manila background. Aggressive. "Mrs. Gable, I've known you a long time," Sterling began, his voice flat and clinical. "You've taken the seniors, the tripods, the ones with the heartworms. But this is different." He finally looked up, his eyes scanning Eleanor's silver hair and the delicate frame hidden beneath her cardigan. Legend isn't just a hard case. He's been returned by 3 separate families in 6 months. The Millers, the Whitakers, the Grahams, all experienced owners. They all reported the same thing. Unprovoked lunging. One minute he's a statue, the next he's snapping at thin air. He's a liability, Eleanor. He's a ticking time bomb. Eleanor felt a familiar, hot prickle of defiance beneath her skin. She looked at the clinical reports, seeing the way they reduced a living, breathing soul to a list of failures. She knew that look. She had seen it in the eyes of the bank tellers who spoke too loudly to her, and in the way her own daughter, Claire, looked at her house as if it were a museum of things that had stayed past their welcome. To the world, she was a liability too. A set of brittle bones and fading relevance. "People see what they expect to see, Arthur," Eleanor said softly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "They see a blocky head and a scar, and they decide he's a monster. Maybe he isn't lunging at them. Maybe he's just trying to tell them something they aren't patient enough to hear." Sterling sighed, sliding a thick stack of yellow paper across the scarred mahogany desk. "If I do this, it's off the books for the shelter. You signed the high-risk liability waiver. You acknowledge that if he snaps, the county isn't responsible. You're on your own, Eleanor. No one is coming to help you if this goes south." Eleanor didn't hesitate. She reached for the plastic ballpoint pen, her fingers gnarled by the onset of arthritis. As she pressed the tip to the paper, her hand shook, not from the weight of the pen, but from the terrifying realization of what she was committing to. She signed her name, the ink bleeding slightly into the cheap paper. With that single trembling stroke, she wasn't just saving a dog from a needle. She was claiming the right for both of them to exist in a world that was finished with them. She handed the pen back, her jaw set. "Bring him to me," she whispered. "It's time to go home." The linoleum floor of Eleanor's kitchen was cold, a stark contrast to the stifling humidity of the Dallas afternoon. Legend didn't sniff the baseboards or investigate the ticking clock in the hallway as a normal dog might. He didn't look for a water bowl or a soft rug to claim. Instead, he moved with a stiff, mechanical gait, his claws clicking rhythmically until he found the narrow corner behind the breakfast table. He wedged his 65-pound frame into the tight right angle of the walls, turning his back on the room and pressing his blocky forehead against the white paint. Eleanor stood by the sink, the silence in the house suddenly feeling heavy, almost liquid. It was a silence she had lived with since her husband passed, but this was different. This was a silence charged with the static electricity of a predator's breath. She tried to hum a soft tune, something to break the tension, but the sound died in her throat. Legend hadn't moved an inch. He was a gargoyle of muscle and white fur, frozen in a posture of absolute defense. He wasn't exploring his new kingdom. He was trying to disappear into the architecture. "You're safe now, Legend," she whispered, her voice barely a ripple in the stillness. She took one tentative step toward the table, her hand reaching out instinctively to offer the comfort she thought he needed. The sound that rose from the corner wasn't a bark or a sharp snarl. It was a low subsonic vibration that seemed to travel through the floorboards and up into Eleanor's own marrow. It was the sound of a structural failure, a warning rumble from deep within a mountain. It wasn't an invitation to fight. It was a desperate, guttural plea for distance. Legend's ears stayed pinned back, and his body didn't shift, yet the air in the room grew 5 degrees colder. Eleanor froze, her hand hovering in midair. In the dim light of the kitchen, she saw the subtle ripple of muscle along his flank and the way he tucked his tail so tightly it looked as though it were being pulled into his chest. This wasn't the behavior of a king guarding his castle. It was the behavior of a soldier in a foxhole, waiting for the final blow. The tension of silence became a physical weight between them, a border wall built of fear and total misunderstanding. Eleanor slowly retracted her hand, realizing that in this house, the first lesson they would both have to learn was how to inhabit the same space without touching. She left him there, a statue of white stone in the shadows, and sat at the table, 2 lonely souls separated by 4 feet of linoleum and a lifetime of unspoken pain. The front door chimed, a sharp, intrusive sound that shattered the fragile truce Eleanor had established with the heavy silence of the afternoon. Claire swept in, the scent of expensive lavender and the frantic energy of the city trailing behind her like a wake. She didn't wait for a greeting. She was halfway to the kitchen when she stopped dead, her leather handbag slipping from her shoulder as her eyes locked onto the hulking white mass huddled in the corner. "Mom, oh my God," Claire whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of revulsion and genuine terror. "What is that? What is that monster doing in your kitchen?" At the sound of the new, sharp voice, the low vibration started again, the subsonic warning that Eleanor had begun to recognize as Legend's only language. It was louder this time, more desperate. Legend didn't turn around. He simply pressed his face harder into the drywall, his muscles bunching beneath his skin like coiled springs. To Claire, it was the sound of a predator preparing to strike. To Eleanor, it sounded like a heart breaking under the weight of its own defense. "He's not a monster, Claire. His name is Legend," Eleanor said, though her voice lacked the conviction she felt in her soul. She stood by the counter, acting as a physical barrier between her daughter and the dog. "I called the shelter when you didn't answer your cell," Claire snapped, her fear turning into an aggressive clinical authority. "Mr. Sterling told me everything. This dog has a red zone bite history. He's been returned 3 times, Mom. You're 72 years old and you're living here alone with a ticking time bomb. Do you have any idea what that animal could do to you in seconds?" Claire paced the linoleum, her heels clicking like a countdown. She didn't see the way Legend's tail was tucked so far beneath him it was almost touching his chin, or the way his entire body was trembling. She only saw the danger. She stopped and pointed a manicured finger, her expression hardening into the look a parent gives a wayward child. "I'm not losing you to this, Eleanor. I won't. I've already been looking at the brochures for the Maples. They have a wonderful suite available starting next month." The blood drained from Eleanor's face. The Maples was the local assisted living facility, a place of beige walls and scheduled activities, a place where independence went to die. It was the very definition of being discarded that she saw every time she looked at Legend. "You wouldn't," Eleanor breathed. "I will," Claire said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm level. "If that animal is still in this house in 7 days, I am calling the social worker and the movers. I'll tell them you're no longer capable of making safe decisions for yourself. It's him or your safety, Mom. It's his life or your freedom. 1 week. That's all you have." Claire turned and walked out, the front door slamming with a finality that echoed through the house. Eleanor was left in the gathering shadows, the silence returning, heavier than before. In the corner, Legend finally let out a long, ragged breath that sounded hauntingly like a sob. Eleanor realized then that the stakes had shifted. She wasn't just fighting for the life of a dog she barely knew. She was fighting for the right to remain the master of her own fate. The clock on the mantel ticked with a rhythmic cruelty, counting down the hours of the 7-day ultimatum Claire had left behind. Eleanor sat in the dim light of her study, the glow of her laptop screen casting long, skeletal shadows across the room. She was digging through the digital archives of the Dallas shelter, following the breadcrumbs of a microchip number that everyone else had treated as a mere serial number. After an hour of scouring probate records and old social media posts from local rescues, she found it. A grainy photo of a younger, vibrant legend sitting beside a man in a wheelchair. The man was Arthur Vance, a veteran who had lived only 10 miles from Eleanor's current home. Legend wasn't wearing a heavy chain or a tactical collar in the photo. He was wearing a faded blue service vest with the words "Medical Alert, Do Not Pet" stitched into the side. Legend hadn't been bred for the pits or trained to be a weapon. He had been a lifeline. He was the dog that sat by Arthur's side through 3 strokes and 4 years of isolation. When Arthur finally passed away alone in his armchair, Legend had stayed by his side for 4 days before the authorities broke down the door. The lunging and aggression in the shelter reports suddenly took on a sickening new clarity. Legend wasn't trying to hurt people. He had been trying to guard the only world he had ever known. He had been dragged away from a cold body by strangers with catch poles and heavy gloves. Every owner since then had tried to break the grief out of him, treating his mourning as malice. Eleanor stood up, her heart aching with a sudden sharp kinship. She walked into the kitchen, where the house was still silent and cold. Legend was still in his corner, his white fur ghostly in the moonlight. She reached into a jar on the counter and pulled out a piece of dried liver, the gold standard of dog treats. "Arthur was a lucky man, wasn't he?" she whispered, her voice trembling. She knelt, keeping a respectful distance, and gently tossed the treat toward his paws. She expected him to sniff it, or perhaps to ignore it in his frozen state. Instead, as the small object flew through the air, Legend didn't lunge. He didn't snap. His entire body underwent a violent, spasmodic recoil. He slammed his back further into the corner, his eyes rolling back to show the whites, and he flinched so hard his head struck the drywall with a hollow thud. He didn't look like a dog expecting a snack. He looked like a prisoner expecting a blow. The vicious pit bull was cowering from a piece of food. Eleanor pulled her hand back to her chest, the realization hitting her like a physical strike to the gut. The world hadn't just misunderstood Legend's heart. They had spent the last year punishing him for having one. The pale afternoon sun cast long, distorted shadows across the overgrown grass of the backyard. Eleanor had hoped the fresh air might soften the edges of the silence between them, but Legend moved through the yard like a man walking on eggshells, his body a rigid line of suppressed tension. He didn't chase the occasional butterfly or sniff the base of the oak tree. He simply stood near the center of the lawn, his head low, his gaze fixed on nothing. The peace was shattered by a sudden sharp explosion of noise. From behind the neighbor's tall cedar fence, a large German shepherd began to bark, a frantic territorial barrage that echoed off the brick walls of the houses. The effect on Legend was instantaneous and violent. He didn't just bark back. He erupted. He lunged toward the fence with a speed that defied his stiff gait, his jaws snapping together with a bone-chilling clack that sounded like a gunshot. "Legend, no. Stop!" Eleanor cried, her heart leaping into her throat. Fear for her neighbors, for the dog, and for the fragile life she was trying to build surged through her. She forgot the warnings. She forgot the liability waivers. She rushed forward, her gnarled fingers reaching out to catch the thick leather of his collar and pull him back from the fray. The moment her hand grazed his neck, the world seemed to tilt. Legend didn't just pull away. He whipped around with a primal guttural roar that vibrated through Eleanor's very boots. His lips were pulled back in a grotesque mask of rage, bearing rows of white teeth that caught the sun. For a heartbeat he looked exactly like the Red Zone monster the shelter had promised he was. Eleanor stumbled back, her heel catching on a tuft of grass, her breath hitching in a sob of pure, unadulterated terror. She waited for the impact, for the weight of him to crush her, for the jaws to close on her arm. But the attack never came. Legend remained frozen, his snout inches from her hand, his eyes wide and clouded with something that looked less like hate and more like madness. As Eleanor stared, her terror began to morph into a sharp, clinical observation. She noticed the fine electric tremor running through his entire frame, a shaking so violent it looked like he was vibrating. Then her eyes traveled down. Legend's back right leg was pulled tight against his underbelly, tucked so high it was almost hidden by his flank. It was quivering, the muscles spasming in a visible rhythmic agony. He wasn't standing on it. He was hovering over the grass, his weight shifted entirely to his front shoulders. The aggressive snarl wasn't a threat of violence, it was a reflexive snarl of white-hot blinding pain. He hadn't turned on her to bite. He had turned because her touch had sent a lightning strike of agony through a body that was already screaming. Eleanor's breath came out in a ragged sigh, the fear vanishing as quickly as it had arrived, replaced by a devastating heavy clarity. He wasn't a ticking time bomb. He was a creature being burned alive from the inside out. The evening was settling into the floorboards when Eleanor turned to walk toward the kitchen, hoping the ritual of tea might steady her nerves. Behind her, she heard the heavy, labored shuffle of Legend trying to follow. He had finally decided to leave his corner, a small bridge of trust being built in the twilight. But as he crossed the threshold of the doorway, his rear end suddenly buckled, his hind leg splaying out like a puppet with its strings severed. What followed wasn't a bark or a howl. It was a high-pitched, piercing shriek that tore through the quiet house. A sound so human, so laden with raw, unmitigated agony that it made Eleanor's knees go weak. Legend didn't try to get up. He lay pinned to the linoleum, his chest heaving, his eyes wide and glazed with a sudden, overwhelming betrayal of his own body. He looked at Eleanor, not with the bared teeth of a predator, but with the hollowed-out shock of a creature that had finally been broken by its own weight. The drive to the emergency clinic was a blur of rain-slicked streets and the sound of Legend's shallow, rapid panting in the back seat. Dr. Miller, a woman with tired eyes and steady hands, didn't talk about behavior or red zones. She moved with a clinical efficiency, sedating the trembling dog and wheeling him behind the heavy lead-lined doors of the radiology suite. When the lights dimmed and the digital plates flashed onto the monitor, Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs. The X-ray wasn't just a medical record. It was a map of a catastrophe. Legend's hip sockets were shallow, jagged craters, the bone-on-bone friction having ground the joints into a mess of inflammation and spurs. "It's grade 4 dysplasia," Dr. Miller said, her voice dropping to a somber whisper. "And here, see this narrowing? His sciatic nerve is being pinched between the vertebrae and the hip bone. Eleanor, every step this dog has taken for the last year has been like walking on shards of broken glass. The slightest shift of his weight would have sent a lightning bolt of fire through his spine." The silence that followed was heavy with a terrible clarity. Every unprovoked lunge, every snap at a previous family, every bared tooth in the yard, it hadn't been malice. It had been a desperate, panicked plea for space. Legend had been a creature in a constant state of torture, guarding himself against the world's touch because he knew that touch meant more pain. He wasn't aggressive. He was terrified of being hurt any further. The monster of the Dallas shelter was nothing more than a soul screaming for mercy through the only language he had left. Eleanor reached out and finally placed her hand on his forehead, and this time Legend didn't flinch. He simply closed his eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath, finally understood. The fluorescent lights of the emergency clinic hummed with a sterile indifference as Dr. Miller tapped the glowing X-ray on the screen. The number she quoted, $4,000 for the bilateral hip replacements and the specialized nerve decompression, felt like a mountain of lead. It wasn't just a bill. It was a choice between a comfortable, safe future and the life of a creature the world had already sentenced to death. Eleanor sat on the narrow vinyl bench, her fingers tracing the worn edges of her checkbook. That money was her rainy day fund, the carefully guarded inheritance and the savings from her husband's life insurance meant to carry her through her final years. To spend it on a dog with a red zone label seemed like madness to anyone with a practical mind. "I can't let him go back to that corner," Eleanor whispered, more to herself than the doctor. "I can't let him die thinking the only thing people have for him is a needle or a cage." When Claire arrived at the clinic, her face was a mask of incredulous fury. She had seen the numbers on the estimate Eleanor had left on the passenger seat of her car. $4,000, Mom? For a pit bull that tried to bite you? You're selling Dad's old Buick to pay for this? You've officially lost your mind. This is senility, pure and simple. You're throwing away your security for a lost cause. Eleanor looked at her daughter, seeing the reflected fear of someone who only understood life through the lens of risk and liability. She thought of the way Legend had looked at her on the floor of the kitchen, the hollow, wide-eyed shock of a soul that had forgotten what it felt like to be without pain. She thought of the blue service vest in the photo, and the years he had spent guarding a man who couldn't guard himself. "It isn't senility to recognize a debt, Claire," Eleanor said, her voice dropping into a register of absolute, unshakable iron. "This dog spent his whole life being a shield for someone else. And when he got hurt, when he finally needed a shield of his own, everyone pointed at his scars and called him a monster." She stood up, her hand steady as she reached for the surgical consent forms. "He isn't broken, Claire. He isn't a ticking time bomb or a mistake. He's just hurting. And I won't have it said that I lived 72 years just to turn my back on someone because the price of their mercy was too high." As Eleanor signed the papers, she felt a strange, buoyant lightness. The Buick was just metal and glass. The savings were just numbers on a ledger. But the life trembling in the next room was a chance to prove that the world was wrong about more than just a dog. She was choosing his life, and in doing so, she was choosing her own right to matter. The weeks following the surgery were a blur of sterile smells and the rhythmic, splashing hum of the rehabilitation center. Recovery didn't happen in a single cinematic moment. It was won in inches and quiet victories. Eleanor spent her mornings watching Legend in the underwater treadmill, his massive frame supported by the buoyancy of the warm water. At first, he had been terrified, his eyes wide as the belt began to move beneath him. But then the realization hit. He lifted his back right leg, and for the first time in years, there was no lightning strike of agony. There was no grinding of bone on bone. He took a step, then another, his gait smoothing out into a fluid motion he had long forgotten. The physical weight of the pain was lifting, and with it, the monster was evaporating. Back at the house, the atmosphere shifted from a cold standoff to a warm living grace. The statue in the kitchen corner had finally melted. One rainy Tuesday, Eleanor was sitting in her armchair, her legs covered by a knitted throw, when she felt a heavy, solid weight press against her knee. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, a ghost of the old fear flickering in her chest. But there was no vibrating growl, no stiffening of muscle. Legend had walked over of his own accord and gently rested his big, blocky head in her lap. He let out a long, contented sigh, his eyes closing as Eleanor's hand found the soft fur behind his ears. He wasn't guarding himself anymore. He was finally resting. As the days turned into a month, a new sound began to echo through the hallways, the soft, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of a tail hitting the floorboards. It started as a hesitant twitch and grew into a full-bodied wag that shook his entire hindquarters. Legend became Eleanor's shadow, his stiff mechanical walk replaced by a joyful trot. He followed her from the kitchen to the garden, from the study to the porch, his presence no longer a source of tension but a source of profound comfort. He didn't just inhabit the house, he filled it. When Claire visited, she found them in the garden, and for once she was silent. She watched the dog who had supposedly been a ticking time bomb gently nudge Eleanor's hand for a scratch, his eyes bright and clear. The silence in the house was no longer liquid and heavy. It was light, filled with the steady breathing of two souls who had finally found their way out of the dark. The golden Texas sun spilled across the porch, warm and thick like honey, illuminating the fine dust motes dancing in the air. A year had passed since the shadow of the needle had loomed over them, and the world felt entirely different now. Eleanor sat in her favorite high-back chair, the wicker creaking softly as she rocked. Beside her, Legend lay sprawled in a patch of light, his once stark white muzzle now dusted with the soft gray of a dog who had finally found the peace to grow old. He wasn't the statue in the kitchen anymore. He was a living anchor. His breathing was deep and rhythmic, his hind legs, now strong and supported by titanium, stretched out behind him without a hint of the tremors that had once defined his existence. When a squirrel chattered in the oak tree, he didn't lunge or snap with reflexive agony. He simply opened one amber eye, let out a soft huffing sigh and went back to sleep. He was a dog who finally understood that his body was no longer his enemy. The sound of tires on the gravel driveway signaled Claire's arrival. As she climbed the porch steps, she stopped, the sharp, frantic energy she usually carried seemingly blunted by the scene before her. She didn't look for a weapon or a barrier this time. She simply watched as Legend, sensing the visitor, didn't growl or hide. Instead, he lifted his heavy head and gently rested it across Eleanor's feet, his tail giving two slow, rhythmic thumps against the wood. A silent greeting, a promise of protection. "He looks happy, Mom," Claire said softly, sitting on the top step. "He looks like a completely different dog." Eleanor reached down, her fingers still gnarled by time but no longer shaking, sinking into the soft fur behind Legend's ears. She realized then that the $4,000 and the sold Buick hadn't just bought Legend his life, they had bought back her own. By refusing to accept the aggressive label stamped on his file, she had successfully torn up the obsolete label the world had tried to pin on her. She wasn't a liability to be managed or a senior to be shuffled into the beige hallways of the Maples. She was a woman who had seen a hidden truth and had the strength to act on it. Legend wasn't just a survivor of a broken system. And Eleanor wasn't just a widow waiting for the end. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, peaceful shadows across the lawn, Eleanor looked down at the dog at her feet. They were protectors of one another, two souls who had been discarded as broken, only to prove that sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to listen to the world when it tells you it's over. They had saved each other, proving that love isn't just a feeling, but the patient, quiet act of finally listening.